The UAP Herald, Case File 034, the Persian Gulf Reaper. It is the middle of the night over the Persian Gulf. The 24th of October, 2023. A U.S. Air Force Reaper drone has been in the air for 2 hours, flying a long, slow orbit over dark water somewhere off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. No one is aboard. The crew sits in a ground control station, watching the world through a single infrared eye slung under the aircraft's nose. And at 1:45 in the morning, Zulu time, a radio call comes up on the frequency, not from their own controllers, but from the other side of the water. Iranian air defense, telling a coalition drone to keep its distance from the border. The crew answers calmly that they are operating in international airspace. The call ends. The Reaper keeps flying its orbit. And then, an hour later, the eye catches something it cannot name, a small, solid object over the open Gulf. On the thermal sensor it reads cold, colder than anything with an engine should. It does not maneuver, it just sits in the frame, moving at an estimated 320 miles an hour, and then it is gone. 41 minutes after that, it happens again. A second object, in the same patch of sea, faster this time. 2 UAP, one night, one drone, over contested water a few miles from Iran. And the whole thing went into a mission report, declassified, in part, nearly 2 years later. This is the UAP Herald. Case File 034, the Persian Gulf Reaper. Let us start, as we always do, with the paper. Because everything you are about to see comes from a government document, not a rumor. On the 8th of May 2026, the US government began publishing declassified files on unidentified anomalous phenomena through a program it calls PURSU, the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP Encounters, hosted on the official portal at war.gov, with support from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. In that release sat a set of files from a single night over the Persian Gulf, a 9-page mission report catalogued as DOW, UAP, D23, and 2 short infrared videos released alongside it, catalogued on the military's own imagery service as DOW, UAP, PR26 and PR27. Both titled the same careful way, Unresolved UAP. Report, United Arab Emirates, October 2023. The mission report is what we have been reading all week. In military shorthand, it is a MIREP, a mission report filed after the sortie, describing what the aircraft did and what it saw. And like every file in this program, it carries a careful government warning. Listen to how it is worded.
These materials are being released for informational purposes only. Nothing in them should be read as an analytical judgment, an investigative conclusion, or a factual determination about the nature, the origin, or the significance of what was observed. The event remains unresolved.
Unresolved. That is the government's own word for this case, and it is the word we are going to hold on to for the next half hour. It does not mean confirmed as anything. It means the file is open, the crew could not identify what they saw, and no one since has closed the case. This is not a leak. It is a record the United States released, with its own name on it, and then declined to explain. And it originally carried the highest workaday secrecy stamp there is, secret, no foreign, not due for release until the year 2048. So who was flying, and why were they over the Gulf at all? The report answers both on page 2. The aircraft was an MQ-9, a Reaper, the long-endurance, remotely piloted aircraft you've seen in 100 news stories. The originating unit is the 50th Attack Squadron, the 50 ATKS, flying under the 432nd Wing, the Air Force's Reaper enterprise under Air Combat Command, And that detail matters, because it tells you what kind of mission this was. This was not a special operations crew hunting a specific target. It was a conventional intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Reaper, the workhorse kind, doing the patient, grinding job of watching. And what it was watching is where the geography gets tense. The report says the aircraft was flying in support of Operation Spartan Shield, a long-running U.S. Central Command operation across the Middle East, built specifically to deter regional aggression, with Iran and its proxies squarely in mind. And it was doing that work in direct support of NAVCENT, U.S. naval forces. Central Command, the Navy's Fifth Fleet, whose waters are the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea. So put the pieces together. A U.S. drone, flown from a base in the UAE, orbiting over Gulf water, feeding imagery to the U.S. Navy, under an operation whose entire reason for existing is Iran, a few miles off the Iranian coast. A few miles off the Iranian coast. Nobody was hunting a UFO. They were keeping an eye on one of the most watched stretches of water on Earth. The report even gives the mission its own private names. The aircraft took off from Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE. The report's ICAO code is Oscar Mike Alpha, Mike, one of the largest U.S. air hubs in the Gulf. And it flew under a reconnaissance track the crew called, in the clear Irish sickle, a sensitive reconnaissance orbit, the racetrack in the sky. This Reaper would fly for the next 17 hours. That is the entirely ordinary reason a U.S. sensor happened to be staring at the Gulf in the dark all night. And the things it saw were not on the flight plan. The report keeps time the way the military keeps time, in Zulu, in 4-digit date-time groups to the second. And if you lay the clock out, the whole shape of the night snaps into focus. Read it with me, because the timeline is the story.
At 0015 Zulu, the aircraft took off from Al Dhafra. At 0030, it was handed over from the launch and recovery element to the mission crew. At 0155, it was on station in sensitive reconnaissance track, Irish sickle.
Takeoff, handover, on station. Utterly routine. The launch and recovery element, the crew that gets the aircraft airborne, hands the controls to the mission crew, who could be sitting half a world away. The aircraft climbs into its orbit and settles in for the long watch. And from just before 2 in the morning until nearly 7 that evening, the report says the Reaper conducted more than 17 hours of imagery intelligence in support of the Navy, the mundane, unblinking heart of the mission. What exactly it was imaging, we are not allowed to know.
Because here the file does something unusual. The entire narrative of what the aircraft was actually doing, the mission's substance, the tasking, the intelligence it gathered, is blacked out on page 5. A single large redaction box, cited under the classification rule as sources and methods and operational security. In most of these mission reports, the narrative survives with a few words struck. Here, the whole paragraph is gone. The government released the sighting and hid the mission around it.
But before the Reaper ever saw a UAP, it had a very human encounter, the kind that reminds you exactly whose backyard this water is. At 1:45 in the morning, while the aircraft was climbing through 23,000 feet, a radio call came up. Not from a wingman, not from its own controllers, from the coast. The report logs it in its own block. Under the call sign it gives the source, Iranian Air Defense.
Guard call. Ground station, Iranian Air Defense. Tone, professional. Aircraft altitude, flight level 230. Airspeed, 158 knots.
A guard call is a radio warning broadcast on the international emergency frequency, a way for one military to speak to an aircraft it does not otherwise talk to. And the message, the report records verbatim, was short.
Maintain safe distance from border.
Maintain safe distance from border. Iranian Air Defense, telling a coalition drone it was getting close to the line. And the crew, or rather the aircraft, answering for the crew, gave the standard, careful reply, which the report also quotes word for word.
This is a coalition aircraft conducting routine operations in international airspace.
Routine operations. International airspace. The whole exchange is a tiny piece of theater that plays out over the Gulf all the time. Iran asserting a claim, the coalition asserting the freedom of the seas, neither side blinking. The report notes the tone was professional and that the calls ceased at that same time. No shots, no intercept. Just a warning, an answer, and silence. But it matters for one reason. It fixes exactly where this aircraft was. This was not a drone lost over the empty ocean. It was orbiting in airspace close enough to Iran that Iran picked up the phone. Remember that, because everything that happens next happens right there. An hour after the Iranian call, at 41 minutes past 2 in the morning, Zulu, the log records the moment this file exists for. The crew was still on station at flight level 243, about 24,000 feet, over open Gulf water. And the sensor caught something. The report is spare about it, which is exactly why it is worth reading slowly.
At 0241 Zulu, observed 1 UAP, friendly aircraft altitude, flight level 243, trajectory 280 degrees. Speed 162 knots.
1 UAP. And then the crew filled out the structured checklist the newer reporting form demands, a field-by-field description of the object. Read the answers in a row because the picture they paint is quiet and specific and a little strange.
UAP physical state, solid. UAP maneuverability observations, none. Observer assessment of UAP, benign. UAP under intelligent control, no. UAP signatures, thermal, showed cold.
Solid. Benign. No maneuvering. And then the field that stops a working analyst, cold, quite literally, thermal showed cold. Now sit with that. This is an infrared sensor. Its entire job is to see heat. A powered object moving at highway speed, an engine, a motor, a warm body, glows on infrared. That is the whole point of the instrument. But this object read cold, colder than its surroundings. On a thermal camera, a moving thing with no heat is a genuine puzzle. It can happen. An unpowered glider, a balloon at the temperature of the high, cold air, an object seen from an angle that hides its engine. But it is the opposite of what you expect from something crossing the sky under its own power. And the report gives that cold, solid object a speed, flagged, carefully, as an estimate and not a measurement.
Kinetic velocity, 320 miles per hour. Accuracy, estimated
20 miles an hour. That is fast for something with no visible engine and no heat. Faster than any small drone, in the range of a regional turboprop or a small jet. But the crew logged no maneuvering and marked it benign. First and last position, the report says, were essentially the same point of C. The object barely moved across the grid before the crew lost it. A cold, solid smudge hanging over the Gulf, gone almost as fast as it came. And the crew did the disciplined thing. They wrote down what the instrument told them, flagged their own uncertainty, and did not pretend to know what it was. And, unlike most cases, we do not just have the paperwork, we have the tape. Alongside the report, the government released 2 infrared videos from this platform, the shorter one 43 seconds, the longer one just under 5 minutes, and they are on our disk. We sat with the long one frame by frame. Let me tell you exactly what it is and exactly what it is not, because both matter, and they do not line up the way a headline would want. For the first half, it is almost boring, and that is the point. A black and white thermal view, looking down from high altitude at a coastline. You can make out a rocky headland, a seawall or breakwater running across the frame, the bright thermal glow of buildings along a harbour, and the flat grey sheet of water below. A cyan crosshair holds the center. A small letter N, the north indicator, sits at the top, drifting as the aircraft slews. This is the imagery intelligence work the mission was actually for, a sensor patiently walking the UAE coastline in the dark. There is nothing anomalous in it. It is a drone doing its day job. And then, in the second half, the picture changes completely. The coastline falls away. The sensor is looking at open water, and a large, diffuse glow blooms across the center of the frame. Bright at the core, fading to grey at the edges, roughly circular, and centered right on the crosshair. A strong thermal source filling half the screen, and the sensor stays locked on it. It is genuinely dramatic. It looks, at a glance, like the money shot. And this is exactly where we have to be honest with you.
Because our own forensic analysis flags that thermal bloom 3 different ways and refuses to pick one. It could be a real, strong heat source out over the water. It could be a glint, infrared light bouncing off the sea back into the lens. Or it could be an artifact of the sensor itself, the imager blooming under a bright input. We cannot tell which from the released frames. And here is the honest tension. The report's 2 UAP were described as small, solid, and, for the first one, thermal cold. A giant hot bloom is not that. So we are not going to tell you this glow is the UAP. It may be a separate moment in a 5-minute clip. The video is dramatic, the report is understated, and a serious investigation names that gap instead of papering over it.
What we can tell you is that the tape is real. We ran it through the same authenticity checks we run on every clip, and it scores 8 out of 10, highly likely authentic. The audio track is dead silent, a flat line, a raw sensor extract with no microphone, exactly what an operational feed sounds like. The thermal grain is the steady, fixed pattern noise of a real focal plane array, frame after frame. The HUD overlay, the reticle, the north indicator, the corner brackets, holds sub-pixel registration across nearly 9,000 frames, which is punishingly hard to fake over 5 minutes. And the redactions sit in the corners and below the crosshair, over the telemetry, the coordinates, the target data, and leave the scene itself in the clear. Whatever the objects were, the footage of that night is genuine government sensor video. It is worth pausing on the machinery that caught all this, because the sensor chain is part of the evidence. The report names the aircraft's targeting turret on page 4, an electro-optical and infrared sensor ball, the multispectral targeting pod a Reaper carries under its nose to find, track, and hold a point on the Earth from miles away. This was not a phone caught out a car window. It was a precision military instrument operated by trained imagery crews who stare at thermal video for a living. And the report logs the rest of the aircraft's nervous system in the same clicked way. It carried a signals intelligence package. The crew's word for it was air handler, collecting electronic emissions for roughly 18 straight hours across the sortie. And the full motion video was not just recorded and forgotten. It was pulled and exploited after the fact by a dedicated imagery cell, Distributed Ground System 2, at Beale Air Force Base in California, half a planet from the Gulf. That is the reach of a modern reconnaissance mission, an aircraft over Gulf water, a crew who could be anywhere, and analysts in California working the tape.
And a small corpus note for the record keepers. This report routes its imagery exploitation through Beale, a different ground station than the other Reaper UAP files in this family, which we have seen run through units in other states. Little discrepancies like that are how you tell a real bureaucratic paper trail from a clean invention. Real records are messy at the edges. Different squadrons, different ground stations, different operations, all bumping together. This one is messy in exactly the ways a real one should be.
Because the night was not done. 41 minutes after the first object vanished. At 22 minutes past 3 in the morning, Zulu, it happened again. Same crew, same orbit, same patch of open Gulf. The sensor caught a second UAP.
At 0322 Zulu, observed 1 UAP. Friendly aircraft altitude, flight level 243, same as before.
Same altitude, same reconnaissance track. And when the crew filled out the checklist the second time, most of the answers matched the first. Solid, no maneuvering, benign, not under intelligent control. But 2 fields were different, and the differences are telling. On the first object, the thermal signature read cold. On the second, the crew wrote simply unknown. They could not characterize it, and the estimated speed had jumped.
Kinetic velocity, 440 miles per hour. Accuracy estimated.
440 miles an hour, 120 faster than the first. 2 objects, 41 minutes apart, in adjacent squares of the same Gulf grid, both solid, both benign, both at the edge of what an infrared sensor could resolve. One cold, one unknown, one at 320, one at 440. The report does not connect them. It logs them as two separate UAP events on the same sortie and leaves it there. And there is one field on this newer form worth stopping on, because it tells you how the government itself is now thinking about these sightings. The report has an explicit line, a yes or no box, asking whether any object or material was recovered from the UAP. On both events, the crew answered, unknown, not no, unknown. Now, no wreckage was recovered off the Gulf that night. Nothing fell, nothing was fished out of the sea. But the fact that the form now demands an answer to that question, on a routine mission report from a drone crew watching the water, that is the quiet structural story here. The military's reporting system has formalized the recovery question. It is being asked every time and logged every time. This file is one of the first places we have seen that field exist at all. So let us do the honest thing and give the skeptics the floor, because on two slow, small, thermal, faint objects over one of the busiest waterways on Earth, there are real conventional candidates, and a serious investigation names them out loud instead of rushing past them.
Start with the boring answers, because over the Persian Gulf in 2023, the sky is crowded. This is one of the most heavily trafficked air corridors in the world. Commercial jets, cargo haulers, military aircraft from a dozen nations, all threading the same narrow airspace between the Gulf states and Iran. A regional turboprop or a small jet fits 320 miles an hour and 440 miles an hour and 440 miles an hour comfortably. Seen head-on or tail-on through an infrared sensor at range, an aircraft's engine heat can be hidden by its own airframe, which would read as thermal cold, exactly what the first object showed. Two aircraft, 41 minutes apart, in the same busy corridor is not a coincidence. It is a Tuesday. Then there are the things that actually hang over that water. The Gulf is full of high-altitude balloons, weather sondes, and tethered aerostats. Surveillance blimps that float for days. A balloon sits at the temperature of the cold air around it, thermal cold, solid, no maneuvering, drifting slowly. That description fits the first object almost perfectly. And the speed is an estimate. The report says so twice, made by eye of a drifting sensor with the telemetry blacked out. Misjudge the object's range, and you misjudge its speed by a wide margin. None of these answers require anything exotic. Every one of them is sitting in the report's own fields. Benign, solid, no maneuvering, effects on equipment, none. That is not the language of a crew that thought it had caught something world-changing. It is the language of a crew logging two unknown contacts and moving on.
That is a strong case, and it deserves its full weight. This is very likely conventional traffic or a balloon. The report itself leans that way in its own understated fields. But fairness cuts both ways, so here is the other edge. The crew are trained imagery analysts who watch this exact airspace for a living. They see commercial traffic and balloons every single sortie, and do not log them as UAP. Something about these two contacts did not fit the routine, enough that a disciplined crew ran them through the anomalous phenomena channel twice in one night. And the first object's thermal signature is the genuine hook, cold, on the instrument built to see heat, moving at 320 miles an hour. That is not impossible to explain. But it is exactly the kind of small, honest anomaly this whole disclosure program exists to collect. Not a tic-tac, not a light show, just a quiet contradiction on a government form that nobody has closed. And here is the context almost every headline drops, because it deflates the drama in the most revealing way. These two sightings were not the mission. They were two brief interruptions in the middle of a 20-hour flight, and what the Reaper did around them tells you how ordinary the extraordinary looked from inside that ground station. After the second object slipped from the feed, the crew simply kept flying the orbit. The report records them continuing their imagery work in support of the Navy for hours more, until late afternoon, when they were finally cleared to return to base.
At 1837 Zulu, cleared to return to base. At 1912 off station. Total time on station, 17 hours and 17 minutes.
17 hours on station. More than 20 hours in the air, gate to gate. That is the real texture of a Reaper sortie, An endurance grind, most of it uneventful, a single crew watching a single stretch of water through the long night and the long day. The two UAP were a few minutes of that. And the report even carries the small internal contradictions that prove a human filled it out. An effectiveness block that notes, flatly, the intelligence gap was not filled, sitting a few lines from the housekeeping that rates the weather no factor and the sortie complete. That is what real paperwork looks like, and it is the same crew, on the same form, who logged two cold, solid objects over the Gulf and then went back to work as if it were just one more thing the night handed them. Which, for a sensor operator over that water, it probably was. There is one more layer to this file, and it is the layer that tells you how the government itself handled it, through what it hid and what it let stand. The redactions here are not random. They are a decision, and the decision is legible.
Under the classification rules the file cites, the government blacked out the things that would fingerprint the aircraft and the mission, the call sign on every line, the tail number, the exact grid coordinates reduced to fragments, and, most tellingly, the entire narrative of what the aircraft was actually doing on page 5. They hid the sensor and the sensing. What they left in the clear was the scene, the water, the objects, the thermal bloom, the Iranian radio call. This is a file built to show you the sighting and nothing that would tell you precisely where the eye that saw it was pointed. And there is an absence stranger than any redaction. The block where a UAP report records its witness. The crew member's name, rank, contact line is not blacked out. It is simply empty. The fields exist on the page, and they were left blank. The event is logged, the observer is a set of dashes. It is as if the sighting was recorded into the form, but never fully processed into the system under a name.
The paperwork trail is precise about the rest. This file was declassified on the 12th of September 2025 by a Major General serving as U.S. Central Command's Chief of Staff, a real, named officer whose title we confirmed against Central Command's own leadership roster. It moved through its own declassification track, a distinct batch from the other waves of these files. And one honest housekeeping note, because we flag our own uncertainties, this same stretch of the UAE coast in October 2023 produced more than one file in the release, catalogued a few numbers apart, and the paperwork can blur between them. We are telling you the case in front of us. D23, and flagging that its near twins exist rather than quietly merging them into one story. And that is the tempo of this whole disclosure. Not a floodgate, a slow, redacted drip, one mission report at a time, each with its own declassifying authority and its own blacked-out lines, trickling onto a public government website over the better part of a year. This one waited nearly 2 years, from the night over the Gulf to the day it appeared online, and even then only in part, with the mission itself still hidden behind a single black box on page 5. Let us lay the whole night out in order one last time, so the shape is impossible to miss.
0015 Zulu, the 24th of October. A conventional Reaper of the 50th Attack Squadron lifts off from Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE and climbs into a reconnaissance orbit over the Persian Gulf called Irish Sickle in support of the U.S. Navy. 0145 Zulu. Iranian air defense radios a professional warning, maintain safe distance from border. The crew answers, a coalition aircraft in international airspace. The calls cease. 0241 Zulu. One UAP over the open Gulf, solid, benign, no maneuvering, thermal cold, at an estimated 320 miles an hour. 0322 Zulu, 41 minutes later. A second UAP, same waters, solid, benign, signatures unknown, at an estimated 440. The Reaper flies on, works its Navy tasking for the rest of the day, and lands back at Al Dhafra that evening. More than 20 hours, gate to gate. And nearly 2 years later, the report and its 2 infrared videos are declassified on war.gov and left unresolved.
So here is the honest ledger. What do we know? We know this is a genuine, government-released mission report and infrared video filed by a real conventional Reaper crew flying from the UAE over the Persian Gulf on the 24th of October 2023 in support of the US Navy under Operation Spartan Shield. We know the aircraft was warned off the border by Iranian air defense that same night. We know the crew logged 2 separate UAP over open Gulf water, both solid, both benign, one reading thermal cold on an instrument built to see heat, at estimated speeds of 320 and 440 miles an hour. And we know the government drew no conclusion and closed nothing. And what do we not know? We do not know what the 2 objects were, though conventional traffic or balloons over that busy, contested water are the strongest ordinary answers, and the report's own quiet fields lean that way. We do not know why the first read cold or why the second could not be characterized at all. We cannot tell you whether the thermal bloom in the video was a real heat source, a glint off the sea, or a quirk of the sensor. Our own analysis names all 3 and picks none. We do not know what the mission was because they blacked out its narrative. The file is real. It is not complete. It is a record of what a US sensor saw over the open Gulf, twice in one night, not a verdict on what it was. A drone orbiting the dark Gulf, a few miles from Iran. A radio warning from the coast, answered and let go, and then 2 cold, quiet objects over the open water. Small, solid, unexplained, watched by a military sensor that could not name them, and logged on a government form that now asks, every single time, whether anything was recovered. Strip away the headline and the hype, and what remains is quieter and harder to dismiss. One night, over contested water, a US reconnaissance drone saw 2 things it could not identify, wrote down exactly what its instruments showed, flagged its own uncertainty, and filed the whole night under a single word: unresolved. Unresolved is not the same word as confirmed. Case File 034. The Persian Gulf Reaper. Every file read. Every claim checked against the record. The UAP Herald. Declassified. Investigated. Filed. A Hive production.